Fantastic. Thank you to the guys from OC&C Strategy. We've now got, bring up on the panel, I'd like to introduce three. We had Jonathan, who will be joining us, who was in the previous session. So Jonathan, thank you for joining us from the AIM group. I have Shaun di Gregorio, who is coming all the way in from Kuala Lumpur. And we have Mostyn Goodwin from OC&C Strategy. So fantastic having all of you join us here for a panel session where I'd like to really dive into a lot of what has been said by the previous two speakers. Now, first of all, let's do a quick introduction. Shaun, do you want to tell us a little bit about Frontier Digital Ventures?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Simon. Thanks for having us again. So Frontier Digital Ventures, we invest in and operate online classifieds and marketplaces in frontier and emerging markets. We've been doing that for about 6 years now. We have a big focus on property portals. We like that particular segment. We also do automotive, so we're in a number of car portals as well. And we have a horizontal classifieds business as well. So we've got all three of the four groups, I guess, covered. We tend to be in LATAM markets and a lot of Asian markets with a little bit in Africa. So we get a pretty good view of things across the place.
Fantastic. Thanks, Shaun. Mostyn, do you want to tell us a little bit about OC&C Strategy and your role there?
Yeah, very briefly, you saw the wonderful video a few seconds ago. I'm one of the partners in our consultancy business. We're a global strategy consultancy, and a large chunk of what we do in the part of the business that I run covers global marketplaces. So many of the people on this call I've sort of hopefully met or worked with at some point. So have probably about 15 years doing this kind of stuff in the space.
Okay, and Jonathan, for those who don't know, you want to give a quick 15 seconds on the AIM group?
AIM group is all about business intelligence. We only work in autos, real estate, recruitment, and horizontal marketplaces. And we do three things: a great business intelligence service, conferences like this one, but also the leading conferences in autos and recruitment, and finally consulting. And it's nice occasionally to be on the other side of transactions from OC&C.
Okay, so fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Let's dive into I think what's interesting, having listened to both Malcolm and Ovidio about you know how they see the trends in the world and the movement from the traditional classifieds model towards a more transaction-based platform. Now, Shaun, let's start in your part of the world. How do you see this occurring? Is this a something that you see happening everywhere in the markets, or is only in specific players?
Oh no, I think we're seeing it everywhere. I think what's interesting is the extent to which it's happening in different markets, the various models we're seeing in different markets. I think if we had this conversation a couple of years ago, there was probably a very one-track vanilla version of transactions, and people were thinking it through. I think what's really interesting over the past 18 to 24 months is that a lot of the different models in property are now being trialed. Some are working, some are not, and you're starting to see a great variation of models around different markets. Real split between developed and emerging markets. You're seeing some really divergent paths. You've got a Zillow who are out there, you know, they're a portal now buying houses, you know, in a very developed, wealthy market, right through to really early stage markets where portals are probably getting into transactions, particularly property portals, because they have to, because the economics make it so. You know, you've got dominant brands where consumers lack trust in a system. So in emerging markets, you're seeing trust emerge as a real competitive advantage. So certainly it's been all about transactions for some time, but interestingly, really now starting to see divergent models appear. A little bit different to how the online classifieds model emerged, where we probably saw in its infancy, we saw a whole lot of different versions of the online classifieds model, and they all converged to basically a best practice, which kind of turned out to be subscriptions and selling ads, and everyone focused on that. It's almost with transactions, we're in that divergent period. And I don't know whether it's going to converge back to a common approach. I get a sense probably not as it did with the classifieds model. I think you're seeing it start out very similarly, but actually become quite different market to market. And just the nuances, whether it be, is there an agent on both sides of the transaction? Is it new property? Is it secondary? Is it sight unseen? Is it apartments? And all the variations you can get right through to, is it a coastal property? Is it a city property? So you can almost cut the real estate database so many ways when you look at the types of properties and the types of markets you have, and you're seeing so many variations on this transaction model. But we've had a view for a long time that, you know, we say the genie's out of the bottle, ain't going back in. So you've got to figure it out. And it's really intriguing watching some models work, some work not so well, and where they're working, and the different iterations that are starting to become quite powerful in some markets as well.
Okay, I'll come back in a few minutes to talk about which models work and don't work, and let's split it by real estate and by automotive. Why don't we just focus on those two buckets? But Mostyn, I mean, I'm curious from your perspective, because you're dealing, I think, primarily in the established markets. Are you seeing the same trends occurring there as well?
I think it's interesting. I think we are, but only for some segments, only for some clients. So what we're definitely seeing is some of the more established businesses getting towards maturity. And in those markets, they're pulling out of a deal. We're talking about take rates. They're pulling, in some markets, pushing up to double figures now of the value of the agent income or the car dealer income as an online classified portal. And in that world, they need to do things a bit differently and a bit more creatively. So one thing they are doing is some of them moving into transaction, either themselves or helping their customers be involved in the transaction. I think that's just one thing we're seeing. Other things we're seeing is moving along the activity chain to things like mortgages, very obviously into a far broader set of solutions for recruiters getting into applicant tracking services. So there's a whole series of other things we're seeing apart from just transactional, I think is one other point to make. And probably the other one is that while this is, it's taking a lot more time than probably some people would think to really see some of these businesses move fully transactional. I think partly there's a risk around one's own customers, there's a risk around the economics. Again, the margins you make in some of these things and the risk you take is much larger. So I think it's definitely a thing. It's a thing probably in some segments more than others. And it's probably also one of the few things we're seeing versus like the only big thing that we're seeing in developed markets.
Okay, and then Jonathan, is this a winner takes all type outcome, or is there, because you think about the traditional model for classifieds, you had a Rightmove, a Zoopla, and everyone else trying to get market share. You had a realestate.com.au, a Domain, and everyone else trying to get a bit of market share. But the size of the transaction markets are so large. Is it possible to have multiple winners operating multiple different models in parallel?
Yeah, I think it is, and I also think there is a whole space for marketplaces to operate, which is enabling the smaller players to really compete in these markets. So if you can provide the platform for your car dealers, for your estate agents to actually match up against the platforms, then you're enabling that and you're bringing a kind of scale to them that they can't deliver on their own. So yeah, I'm a believer it can be a quite diverse marketplace still. And I also, I note again, Carvana's only at 2%. The iBuyers are buying certain sorts of homes only. These are kind of relatively niche at this stage, though those models will develop.
Okay. So Shaun, I want to go back to the because you've got primarily an emerging market view of the world. What are you seeing work and not work? And let's start with the automotive segment.
Yeah, so I mean, automotive in emerging markets is quite fascinating because it's a very aspirational segment of the market. And if you think about the economics of car portals, they tend to really start to work once you get a GDP of around $4,000 to $5,000. So it kicks in pretty early in terms of the economics of a market. We've always found car portals can actually be really good businesses slightly before property portals in a lot of emerging markets, just based on the economics. In terms of what we're seeing, how are these portals evolving? We all know that in the car segment, a lot of the ad dollars is in the new car market, but a lot of the volume remains in the second-hand car market. So in the second-hand car market, we've seen emerging market startups going into markets and trying to replicate a lot of what's happening in developed markets by offering to buy your car. In the second-hand market, the economics of that is really, really difficult. So if you've got a second-hand car in an emerging market, the margins on the transaction of that car are quite small. It might be $300 to $500. You've got to find a way as a startup or a disruptor to come in and that's the economics of what you're trying to chase is $300 to $500 profit on each car. And you've got to share that with the guy selling it. He's got to pay his bills. He's still got to make money. So you might start out and say, well, maybe we can get $40, $50, $100. It's still a really hard road to hoe. So in emerging markets, in the second-hand market, we've seen a lot more activity before the transaction. So think about pre-purchase inspections, finance, insurance, testing of cars, even through to spare parts. So you've seen a lot more activity around the transaction in the second-hand car market. than you have necessarily just at the point of transaction. And remember that the secondhand car market, it's a very cottage industry in a lot of places still, and even more so in emerging markets where you've got a very large volume of people with somewhere between 3 to 5 to 10 to 12 cars on their lot. And they proliferate through the suburbs. So it's a really tricky market to try and monetize based on the transaction. So you see a lot more around it. Certainly in the new car market, which is where all the aspirational buyers are, which is where a lot of the high value transactions are happening. And what's happened in the last 3 or 4 months has really accelerated the innovation in this space. So, you know, we've got a business in the Philippines, which now you can buy from start to finish, you can buy your car. You can put your deposit down, you can get your loan, you can order it from the dealer and they'll deliver it. Without leaving your lounge room. So I think we've seen a rapid uptake in that. And I think that would have taken a lot longer. I think one of the earlier speakers mentioned that a lot of this innovation has been sort of brought forward, which I think is true right around the world. And certainly in emerging markets, we've seen a whole lot of activity on the new car side and digitizing the whole process. There's almost more has happened in a short time in that than there's probably happened in the last, well, however long, and was probably going to take another 3 to 5 years to see it happen. But if I can sit in a place like Manila in the Philippines and I can buy a new car, a new Toyota online, I can read about it, I can watch videos, I can put my deposit down, I can have it delivered, I can get my loan, and it's dropped off in my driveway. That's a pretty remarkable sequence of events in markets that you wouldn't expect to see that happen now. And we're seeing that in a lot of emerging markets. So rapid acceleration of innovation around new cars. Secondhand car market, still a pretty hard road to hoe if you're trying to get around the transaction given the value.
Simon, can I just add one thing
yes.
here? So one of the advantages it seems to me that marketplaces really have is that they don't have to go straight to the transaction. There are lots of pieces of pipework around the transaction which have their own value. So the financing, sorting the contracting behind the scenes, etc. One of the things marketplaces can do is pick those pieces off one by one within their existing model. And that gives them an interesting way forward rather than having to go straight to the red button to buy things.
Okay. And Mostyn, are you given, you know, you guys deal with in the automotive space, but in the established markets, are you seeing the same trend there occur as well? Or is there more value in a used car? And thus there's more capacity to make money out of it?
I think, firstly, just to agree with what Jonathan's saying, that most of the big incumbents are so entrenched with their dealers for the right reasons and providing services to the dealers. They're much more comfortable helping the dealer with the transaction, providing the services to sit around it, than trying to cut the dealer out of the space. So, and I guess moving metal around with all the hassle that comes with it is not particularly compelling for a digital marketplace. I'm definitely in Jonathan's camp. I suppose the other perspective from a developed market is that auto has been transactional in the B2B space. So part exchange, dealer to dealer, with businesses like Mannheim and BCA for 10 plus years, offline and online auctions. And those businesses then got into Via Kauf and We Buy Any Car, and then the Auto One business all came through. So in a business to business context with dealers, it's always been transactional. It's now increasingly online transactional. What you're starting to see now is it's bleeding into, in the sort of the insurgent space, it's bleeding into consumer, which is where you're seeing some of the new models buying direct from consumer and selling straight on. But it's not necessarily as new as you'd think.
Okay, Shaun, quickly, what was the name? Someone's asking, what is the name of the site in the Philippines where you can buy it fully online?
It's called Auto Deal.
Auto Deal. Okay, autodeal.ph or something?
.ph, yeah.
Okay, right. So that makes sense in the you know, automotive space, and clearly, you know, there are a bunch of players to watch out. You know, if you're operating in that space, there are a bunch of players to clearly watch. What about the real estate space? Okay, you know, you've got a whole bunch of traditional real estate portals, the REAs of the world, the Rightmoves of the world. How do, you know, let's start with the established markets first in this conversation. Can they further progress? You know, if you look at what Malcolm talked about, getting into these platform businesses and becoming a true marketplace, can those traditional players make that transition? Mostyn, what do you think?
Let's start with rental, because that's probably where I'm most agree with Malcolm. So businesses, some of the rental platforms like Open Rent in the UK, you can see really good services now, digital services for landlords on the sell side and the management side, probably just as efficient as agents used to be, if not more so. and then obviously great for the tenant and all the services that sit around it. So you can definitely see in developed markets a lot happening in rental, and that's obviously where a good proportion of industry profit can come from. On the sale part of view, again, I think we're probably more of the view that it's going to take a while for higher end properties to sell directly online. You might see elements of some new build already being transacted online, but as to when Rightmove itself moves into the transaction for sale, you'll see Axel Springer and others investing in businesses to learn. So their investments, I think it's Home Day they've got and Purple Bricks they've got, when they're actually now, they're learning to do it themselves, but actually in terms of taking that big jump to, again, to try and cut people out of the transaction, that feels like it's a way off. Certainly from the development.
Is it a case, but is it a case of cutting the industry out of the transaction, or is it a case of providing end-to-end tools so that the industry becomes more efficient and effective and has to use your platform to complete transactions?
Well, that's exactly the point Jonathan was making at Auto, that if I can make my life easier for, in this case, an estate agent, by having the economies of scale to put in technology they can't afford themselves, by having the economies of scale to put in place mortgage deals that they can't put in place themselves, that's great, especially for the independents versus the franchises. So you can be that platform that people sit on top of like an Open Rent, that's great. Facilitating my customers is very different to obviously cutting them out. So if there is that middle ground like exists in Auto that I haven't yet seen in real transactional real estate, and then that's also a great place to be. It fits in around the edges versus right in the core at the moment.
Okay. Now, Shaun, you guys have an investment in Infocasas, for example, in Latin America. Maybe want to do a bit overview of what they do and how do you see that sort of model playing out?
Well, I mean, they come at, I guess, transactions and evolution from a very traditional classifieds base. So they've been a classifieds business, they've created their marketplace, they've established their brand, and they've established trust. So I think that forms a really important part of, do you want to get into transactions, and if so, to what extent and what part of the market? Having a trusted brand. I think it goes to the difficulty that these brands having coming into markets and decide to be the transaction guy day one. It's a very long path. Infocasas is really good heritage in that sense. And they use a very tech-enabled platform to help connect buyers with sellers. So you see in some transactions models, it might be geared more toward helping a seller or more toward helping a buyer. Certainly in the case of Infocasas, they've got a really intriguing tech approach to matching buyers with sellers. So their business is really geared around helping buyers, perhaps more than they do the sellers in that sense. So they'll work with a buyer very closely. They'll understand their needs. They use a really interesting AI platform that they've developed, a proprietary platform, which is a chat platform, which learns as it goes. So it's learning about what the buyer wants, it's taking feedback, and it's pushing that lead through to its sellers. So then Infocasas then work with property developers and say, hey, you know, there's a pipe of 100 leads here. We can cultivate those 100 leads into really high value buyers. So it's a little bit different than sort of sitting there and just saying to a developer, hey, we want you to advertise on our website, and by the way, we're going to take commission. So they've gone one step further and said, we actually want to evolve this transaction. So let's work on these leads that you're getting, and at the core of it, as a classifieds business, they're really good at generating leads. That's their core proposition, is generating leads. But they work really effectively with taking those leads, refining them, presenting them to the developer customer, working very closely with the developer customer in closing those leads and generating transactions. So in no case are they displacing the salesperson from the developer. They're actually working really closely with that person, but bringing a far higher quality lead who's ready to buy, and then they're happy to facilitate that process as well. So I think a mark of their success is, you know, when they were looking at this model and they were rolling it out, they were getting handed projects by developers, which the developer was finding very difficult to sell for various reasons. They were doing traditional media, they were doing television, billboards, radio, and they just couldn't shift their stock. And they hand it to Infocasas, and Infocasas say, hey, we've got a whole bunch of leads that we've been cultivating because that's our core business. We've now got a technology which can help refine those leads and actually get you the buyers you want. And they were able to shift a whole lot of inventory for developers that the developer themselves thought was impossible to sell, too difficult to sell. Maybe the price point was wrong. But they've got a really light touch, high-tech way of enabling transactions ahead of displacing anyone. And we think it's a really cool model, because what it does is it slots into the process. It actually just improves the process. and makes the journey of a buyer far better, far more productive. Certainly from a sell side, you know, those that are a bit reluctant to embrace it automatically see higher quality leads that they close faster. So probably a really good example where a traditional portal has been able to engage with the industry, go into the process and simply make the process better without displacing anyone along the way necessarily.
Yes. But they are progressively owning the process.
Well, by virtue of being in it, they own it, right? So they're far deeper into where the lead is coming from at its origin, and what's happening to that lead at its conclusion. You know, a typical classifieds business, it's a little bit transactional in the sense of the word, where the lead comes in, bounces out, and they never see it again. You know, infocasters are now going much further down or much further earlier to get the lead, refine it, understand it, and following it right through to the transaction. But really, I guess, enabling a transaction that perhaps might not have happened before by, as you say, being involved in it.
Now, as these real estate platforms emerge, we've got about 5-6 minutes left, so I want to explore one thing. These real estate platforms emerge. You have Fazwas, you have Square Yards, you have Infocasters. They're emerging around the world, and they're very much saying for new developments, for established home sales, and for rentals, and some are specialists in 1, 2, or 3, and they're saying, I want to understand the end-to-end process, and I want to optimize as much as physically possible, remove humans where I can out of the process, so that I can basically drop all the costs, improve the efficiency of lead generation and lead conversion, and thus capture a greater chunk of the revenue that is emerging in that market. If that's occurring in all markets, and we see All My Homes in Germany, all new homes, All My Homes, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name exactly right, in Germany doing it with new developments, what risk does that pose to the Scout24, Scout24s, the Rightmoves, the REAs of the world? Is there any risk to them in this whole process? Jonathan, what do you think?
I think there's lots of risks to them. I think what you've got to do is come back and look at your business and say, not I want to do transaction, but how am I really going to help my clients eliminate the friction points here? And if you don't do that, then you will consign yourself to being, living somewhere in the past. So yeah, I think you can't avoid the risk. You've got to deal with it.
Okay, Mostyn, you guys clearly are knee deep in these established markets. How do you see that as a potential risk for the established players?
The worry for the big entrenched players is that somebody comes in and chips away at the margin, and then over time just takes the next layer and the next layer. So the really good examples, you think of online recruitment, where sort of casual jobs and sort of short-term jobs go mobile and go app-driven. And then from there, then you get into deep blue-collar jobs and blue-collar into white-collar jobs. So when you see these insurgents taking on the edge of the market, that's the question. Then how do you then draw a very clear line between what they're doing and what you're doing, and fight very aggressively on those edge cases where they're starting to take the next step into what you're doing? So Le Bon Coin versus Sologer in France, going from C2C to B2C, what do? Well, you probably have to draw a very clear battle line between how far you'll let them get and how far you won't. So I think these are real risks, like Jonathan was saying, but I don't think you should view them as insurmountable if you're an incumbent. It should be about what investments I'm going to make on the edge to just put them in a box and keep them in a box. I suppose you've always got plan B, which is the Google approach, or Amazon, which is if they get too good, you buy them. So you're still not exactly exactly scuppered yet, but you need to just think clearly about what you're going to do.
Okay. And then I think the last related question around that, and Sean's probably relevant for you, is you see this a lot in emerging markets, that the traditional portals don't have access to all the leads. So you can get them from Facebook, from Google, from vertical search sites and so on. And do you think that if that's the case, then these platforms, which are basically working with, say, new developers, sourcing listings and then marketing, but they don't care if they're on an REA, they can be an REA and being or a Rightmove, as well as Google and Facebook and other areas. Does that also add to the risk of a decrease in advertising revenues for these traditionally large players?
In emerging markets?
In emerging markets, but that then almost retrofitting back into established markets.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is that, you know, if you look at the Scouts and the Right Moves and the REAs, they're in the entire ecosystem, right? And that's happened in 20 years, and they've displaced the previous owner of the ecosystem, which was print, which took 100 years to get where it got to. So in 20 years, we've seen all of that compress. And in the last few years, we've seen I guess the ground shift again, whereby a new player can come into a market and they don't have to be everything to all people. They don't have to roll out the classified playbook. They don't have to get 10,000 agents and 5 million people. They can say, right, I'm just going to be an urban site. We're going to focus on 2-bedroom apartments because that's the volume part of the market, and they're 150 grand, and that's all we're going to do. And I guess their ability to be nimble enables that. And I think in emerging markets, you've also got really messy markets, right? So the transaction, even if you've got a dominant portal in cars or houses, particularly houses, the experience is still not great. You know, you've still got a lot of duplicate listings. You've still got a lot of phishing leads. It's not a pure experience. So it does leave itself open to people who come in and say, well, I'm going to be a smaller business. I'm never going to be the biggest. I'm going to be a smaller business, and I'm going to go after new builds, and I'm going to have a high quality experience for users or consumers. And I think that's where you're seeing some really interesting shift. And that's why I think you see portals in emerging markets. So I just can't sit on a classified ad stream. I've got to go do transactions as well. I've got to own that part of the market because economically it's a great part of the market to be in. So you've got a lot converging in emerging markets where the rules aren't quite the same, the boundaries are not the same, the regulatory environment is not the same. Therefore, far messier and far more open to people coming in and disrupting parts of the market. And hence, you know, the motivation for a market leader, a classified market leader, to go further into the transaction is half opportunity, half necessity, because they actually have to defend that space. I'd argue that Rightmove, Scout, REA can probably live pretty well for a number of years to come, milking the ad dollar and buying mortgage companies and helping with all those peripheral services without necessarily finding themselves into the transaction. But the dynamic of an emerging market, as I said, it's half motivation, half necessity, because the ground is shifting so fast.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Fantastic panel, really interesting insights. I think what we come out of this with is clarity that we are, whether we like it or not, remorselessly moving towards a transaction-driven model. The COVID-19 crisis has pushed that even further. And I think, as Shaun mentioned before, the genie is well and truly out of the bottle, and we will not be going back to the old ways. So thank you very much, Shaun, Mostyn, and Jonathan for a fantastic panel.